that it's 2 minutes past 9 here in Washington, D.C. I think we're going to get started. We still have people logging in. We're getting some messages about people trying to connect, but let's get started. My name is Neha Sharma, and I lead the Evaluation and Learning Initiative here at the Climate Investment Funds. I will be starting us off today. Before we begin, just some really quick housekeeping. So if I could request to move to the next slide, please. We're very pleased to be offering interpretation services today in French and Spanish. You can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to select your preferred language. If at any point you want to hear the original audio, you can press unmute to original audio, and that will remove the interpretation. Please note that you're also free to use the chat function at any point in time. You can ask questions, feel free to introduce yourself or to share any comments or suggestions. Next slide, please. This event marks the launch of a new learning platform at the Climate Investment Funds. It's being launched associated with the Nature, People, and Climate, or the NPC program. And it's really been set up based on demand coming from our client countries that were interested in the NPC program, whether or not they were receiving funding directly from the program or not. And this demand was to bring countries together that could benefit from peer-to-peer exchanges and expert advice on nature-based solutions. So the intention of this platform is to build a better understanding of nature-based solutions, to facilitate peer-to-peer exchanges and learning on nature-based solutions, particularly South-South exchanges that we've seen through our experience at the CIF tend to be underfunded, and to develop new analytical content and evidence on what works when it comes to nature-based solutions. These objectives reflect the objectives of the Evaluation and Learning Initiative at the Climate Investment Funds. So the initiative was set up 6 years ago to take forward the Climate Investment Fund's Learning Laboratory mandate, and the learning platform that we're launching today reflects that intention as well. Next slide, please. The agenda for today is to introduce to you very quickly the NPC program and the learning platform that's associated with it, to introduce to you nature-based solutions and share some findings from the evaluation of the expressions of interest that were received for the NPC program, and then also to have a discussion on how to scale nature-based solutions in developing countries. Next slide, please. The people that you'll hear from today, I've already introduced myself. I'm Neha Sharma. I lead the Evaluation and Learning Initiative at the Climate Investment Funds. But you'll also hear from Paul Hartman, who is the lead for the NPC program and the forestry portfolio here at the Climate Investment Funds. You'll hear from Amita Ramachandran, who is the coordinator for the learning platform. And you'll hear from David McCauley, who is a veteran environment and climate policy finance specialist and is currently a senior climate finance advisor at the Global Environment Facility. He was also the chair for the committee that evaluated the proposals, the expressions of interest that were received for the NPC program. So you'll hear from us in the first 30 minutes of today. After that, there'll be a panel of experts who will speak about how to scale nature-based solutions. We will properly introduce them later on, but just to entice you to stay through the whole duration of this webinar, we're putting their pictures up here right now. We'll have Daniela Faria, who's from the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. We have Hisham Osman, who's from the World Bank, based out of Kenya. We have Rodrigo Finchiera, who's from the Dominican Republic. We have Antiferus Worku, who's from the Forestry Department in Ethiopia. And with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Paul, to introduce to you the NPC program. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Neha, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Hartman. I am the lead for the Nature, People, and Climate program. I'm going to provide a very short overview of the NPC program before we get to the meat of the session today. I will say that we have done a couple of nature series events where significantly more detail is provided on the NPC, and you can watch these on our YouTube channel. So if the information here is not detailed enough, you can log on to the CIF YouTube channel and find these nature series events. Next slide, please. So the first question that people have is, why are nature-based solutions needed? Well, over 50% of the world's GDP is dependent on these. Agriculture, food and beverages, and construction are the largest sectors dependent on nature. and they generate about $8 trillion in gross value added. Oceans, forests, and other ecosystems also can deliver significant support to the GDP. While that's the case, they also are contributing to significant, or have the potential to contribute to significant carbon reductions and removals of up to 5 trillion, I think, gigatons per year by 2030. But they should be planned in a way that has more than just carbon and climate benefits. Done correctly, nature-based solutions should reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also support adaptation and resilience strengthening. They should support livelihood development, particularly of indigenous people and local communities. And of course, nature has to support biodiversity conservation. That said, if we are going to meet the commitments globally that have already been made to the various COPs, climate COP, biodiversity COP, land degradation, investment in nature-based solutions has to increase threefold by 2030 and by fourfold by 2050. This is where MDBs, the multilateral development banks, are really critical in achieving these goals. So for the CIF, we're moving into a frontier area, working with nature-based solutions, working with countries, working with MDBs. And this means that this is a new area for many of the countries and even for the MDBs with whom we're working. This is the role of CIF, to really push through pioneer approaches to help us tackle the global climate crisis. Next slide, please. So this diagram shows a little bit about the program itself. It's prefaced on a landscape management approach, so really looking at how landscapes are integrated in their management, and how what happens, one part of the landscape will affect other parts of the landscape. The program is really looking at how to support both the environment, so safeguard the environment, and safeguard people. So you can see on the top of this circle, the environmental aspects of the program included sustaining forests, coastal, and natural capital, reducing land-based emissions, improving resilience of lands, and then on the people side, which is of course integral to the Nature People Climate Program, boosting nature-positive, equitable livelihoods, reducing the vulnerability that communities face to climate change. We have a very specific focus on increasing engagement with IPLCs, and we also are trying to focus on disaster risk management where appropriate. Next slide, please. The program was launched in June of last year, and at that time we put out a call for proposals. We saw great demand from across the globe. We received 48 expressions of interest, which represent over 50 countries. A great deal of these expressions of interest came from Africa. There was a selection process, which David McCauley was one of the co-chairs of, and our trust fund committee then eventually selected 10 of these EOIs into the program. So there's still a lot of opportunity for these countries and for others who've applied for this program to learn from what's going on the NPC, and that's the foundation of this learning platform. An analysis that we've done of the EOIs, and we'll be happy to share that with you as well, came up with a few points that for us to consider. First of all, there's still a lot to learn about the foundations of nature-based solutions. As I mentioned, this is not a concept that's very well understood at this point. So understanding their co-benefits, understanding the positive externalities is really integral if we're going to start designing and developing good initiatives related to NBS. Financial and non-financial instruments to tackle institutional policy market failures, still there's a bit to learn on that. We've really struggled on the land-based side to engage in private sector strategies to unlock investments in NBS. So for example, our forest investment program, which is a $770 million, has 3 private sector projects. It's much more challenging than the energy side of the CIF, where engaging the private sector is integral to the outcomes of the program. And finally, the importance and the role of Indigenous people and local communities still needs some clearer understanding, the role that they can play in not just being engaged, but also being part of the solution. So I think with that, Amita, oh, I have one more, I'm sorry. So what's upcoming for the learning platform? So I think today we are trying to gather some input, and Neha will provide a poll to hear from you what you think might be interesting, but we are planning as well at the next Trust Fund Committee meeting for those partners who will be there to have a specific input session. That'll be in November. As I mentioned, we have this nature webinar series that we've been undertaking this year. The next one that we're planning, hopefully before the end of the year, would be around MBS and gender, particularly women's leadership and land and resource rights. And then finally, this past year, we did hold a knowledge exchange event in Africa. We do hope to replicate that. So this is person-to-person, south-to-south exchange. Hopefully, we can do that in Asia and perhaps Latin America in the next fiscal year, but certainly we within the next calendar year, we'd like to see both of those done. So I think that's the end of my presentation. I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And just to stick to time, we're going to pass straight to David and hear from him a little bit more about what nature-based solutions are and what we found when the expert committee evaluated the expressions of interest received for this program. David, over to you.
Sure, thanks. Pleasure to be with you. And Paul's given a very good introduction already, so I'll go straight into this. But I just was in New York last week during New York Climate Week on the sidelines of UNGA. And I must say that there's a very strong interest in this sort of climate-nature nexus, if you will, including food systems. And can you get the next slide? Thanks. And so you'll see that the interest is still building. I think that on the private sector side, particularly on business, the incorporation of nature-related risks as well as opportunities is growing with the release of new guidelines on that in terms of reporting and so forth. So that's part of what's driving the interest on the private sector side, both the business and finance communities. But as you've heard from Paul, the CIF program on nature, people, and climate is trying to mirror that and to incorporate it, the opportunity under this program. It is attractive because of the multiple benefits that can be achieved. Thus the title, Nature, People, and Climate. And I think that there's a real opportunity here. However, the experience thus far, as Paul also indicated, is that it's a bit disparate, and thus this learning platform with the initial 10 countries or programs at least, I think should be quite helpful as we go forward. I think the independent expert panel that was involved with screening the 48 expressions of interest that were submitted found evidence of what I've just said. That is, the understanding of the concepts is quite mixed. Particularly the applied aspects of nature-based solutions varied tremendously. And what I'd like to try to do is to briefly go through some sort of alternate perspectives on nature-based solutions, just to get this whole webinar started, to get you thinking about how you're coming at this particular societal challenge, whether it's driven primarily by climate or more by concern about the degradation of ecosystems, or is it some combination of all of those that are tied to livelihoods? And then briefly to discuss some of the economic and financial analysis challenges, the tracking of results, as well as the need for supportive policy and regulatory frameworks. Next slide, please. So let me start with presenting just briefly two ways of looking at nature-based solutions that we see in terms of how this is being applied. The first what I've called here a typology is more geared towards the ecosystem ecosystems to be managed, and that is, sort of what is it that what are the natural systems that you're working with, and trying to enhance their ecosystem services, their functionality to achieve your goals, whether that be on climate or otherwise. And in just a minute, I'll get to a second typology that's more about how you want to go about that. But first, let's look at this first perspective. We see across the application of nature-based solutions many that start from this perspective. They're involved with mangrove conservation or coral reef conservation or rainforest conservation, or perhaps savannas, or it's in a river basin context, perhaps looking at freshwater systems. Examples would be, say, in the freshwater would be the reestablishment of traditional wetlands in a river basin, such as what Pakistan is doing in the Indus Basin following their terrible flood recently, or finding coral reefs that are likely to survive global sea warming and enhancing their sustainability in order to keep them, to protect shorelines, or as I mentioned, mangrove based or others. So this doesn't necessarily have to be limited to natural systems. Definitely there are, within the broad category of nature-based solutions, there's quite a bit of attention to agroecosystems and even to the built environment, to greening of urban areas, to the watersheds within which urban areas are located, for example. Next slide, please. And then the second perspective would be about the type and degree of system management. So this is more about how, and many of the nature-based solutions that we see are organized in this way. They're more having to do with the approach that's being taken rather than the ecosystem per se. So we see those that really, if you think of it in terms of degrees of intervention, starting with the preservation or conservation of natural systems, for example, the conservation of standing forests for their carbon sequestration sinks and sequestration services, or the regeneration of natural systems through assisted natural regeneration is a growing area and an important one that allows for an acceleration of the recovery often of logged forests or semi-degraded lands, or the restoration of ecosystems on lands that perhaps have been more degraded and through afforestation or reforestation. And then finally, as you get into well-managed agroecosystems, productive systems, their sustainable management, and finally, the blending, often you'll hear this term of green and gray, the gray referring to traditional sorts of engineering approaches such as shoreline erosion control through the building of physical barriers versus the reconstruction of dunes or some combination of those two, or in a river system, levees versus the rewetting of traditional flood retention areas in natural wetlands. So those are some examples. Next slide, please. And very briefly went through the 10 expressions of interest that are now moving forward under the Nature, People, and Climate program. And you can see some variation here in terms of the sort of starting point. And these are based on the expressions of interest, by the way. They're not reflective of how these ideas have evolved after the initial scoping missions that have already occurred in a number of places. But you can see here that, for example, the Zambezi Basin Regional Program very much is built around the river basin. Therefore, it's coming at it more from a typology one as to what is the ecosystem to be managed. Likewise, in Kenya, where there's a very strong focus on forests, whether natural or well managed. Whereas in Egypt, for example, it's much more of a focus on a heavy management in agro ecosystems and shoreline ecosystems, where there's a mix of the green and gray infrastructure and so forth. You can see that looking through whether Dominican Republic or Fiji with their ridge to reef approaches, or in Brazil where it seems to be the initial thinking was looking more at it from a standpoint of preservation and restoration, regeneration of forests. I understand now that the focus there is on Cerrado, and we'll be hearing, I guess, later on that. So I won't try to second guess that. Look forward to hearing that presentation. And likewise, you can see this is the sort of typology application. Next, please. So just to reiterate before closing, the key features, that is on the multiple benefits, whether through adaptation, and recalling that the benefits here are not so much through efficiency gains as they are through avoiding future damages. Climate adaptation is hard sometimes for people to get their heads around because things are getting worse and will continue to get worse. But the question is, can you use these sorts of approaches and effectively to avoid future damage or to reduce those damages for especially for local communities. On the mitigation side, it's very much dominated by vegetative sinks and sequestration, but also soil carbon, as well as avoided emissions. There's a bit of a debate about the whole RED approach and how does that fit within a sort of conceptual framework of nature-based solutions, but it's very much part and parcel of that. And I should say that the largest area of interest up to date around nature-based solutions has been around forests and around the offsets, and there's a lot of debate there as well, but very much mitigation oriented. And I think that this is, if you look at the expressions of interest, by and large, the countries were much more interested in the adaptation benefits. And I think rightly so, because as we get into better understanding nature-based solutions and have a stronger track record and more analysis, I think we will find that actually the net benefits from these approaches are likely to be larger on adaptation, especially over time as the risks grow, than from mitigation. But it's the blending of the two that is the key, as well as with biodiversity conservation and reversing, halting and reversing biodiversity loss, contributing to global goals in that area, whether at the landscapes level or looking at specific characteristics of specific ecosystems and species. And finally, of course, development and livelihoods, including gender aspects and engagement of local communities and indigenous peoples, all part of the picture. Then on cost considerations.
David, sorry if I could ask you to wrap up in a minute so we could.
Yes, wrapping up, yes. On cost considerations, I think that there are a number of innovations needed here, but as we gain a track record, then there will be stronger basis for comparison going forward. The next slide, just to close. And so you can see here just to reiterate these overall dimensions of nature-based solutions. And I think there's one more. Yeah. In closing, so you need a strong, consistent approach. These guidelines for the NPC program to support investment program and project design are coming, and the learning program. This is just the start, and look forward to working with you further on it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Paul, for setting us up really well for the panel that will follow. Sorry to keep you right on time. We wanted to spend a little bit more time with the panelists today. But you've introduced the NPC program, you've told us what nature-based solutions are and why they're important, and you've set us up well for the conversation that will follow. We had a quick poll for the participants here today that we wanted to launch. Could I please ask the organizers to launch the first question on Zoom? The first question is really to get to know, you don't see it on your screen here, but the first question should be appearing in front of you now. And it's just to get to know a little bit who has joined us today. So if you could tell us your affiliation, whether you're from the government or the private sector or academia. We'd also like to know from you what NBS scaling issues you're most interested in learning about through this learning platform or through other interactions you're having with colleagues. And we want to know what type of activities you think would be most helpful in preparing you for future future investments, such as the ones that are being given through the NPC program, through the Nature People Climate Program. So if you could just take a quick minute to fill in this poll. And in the meanwhile, I wanted to also ask if you had any questions to post them in the chat or to raise your hand. We could probably take one or two questions for David or Paul. And while you're filling in this poll and thinking about your questions, maybe I'll pose a question to David and ask him if he can quickly reflect a little bit on a question we received when we were registering participants for this workshop. A participant asked, how can we validate and scale NBS, particularly practiced by local communities? So David, did you have a few reflections to share before we close the poll and share the poll results?
Well, as I said, thank you. As I said, we're still in the early stages. I think that there are a few academic approaches that have been applied that are just in the beginning in terms of validation. One of the key questions out there has been the cost effectiveness or the relative costs of nature-based solutions versus others. And I think that's an important area for further analysis. So as we go forward with the NPC program, the opportunity to document the net benefits associated with these approaches will be a very important one. and also engagement of local communities in that process, I think will be a key. But as we develop a wider body of work around nature-based solutions, we'll have numbers that can be applied in terms of the cost per hectare of similar approaches, for example, and then that will really help to during design, moving from one country to another, to sort of benchmark the costs that are being anticipated in a newly designed program against what the experience of others. So that again would argue for this sort of South-South exchanges and cooperation that is being put forward by the learning platform.
Thanks, David. And we just have a quick question here also in chat about incentives. What incentives can be viable to ensure local communities own up to nature-based solutions? Do you have any quick reflections on incentives?
Well, in my limited experience with the applied side of nature-based solutions, I find that communities generally tend to start with a nature-based approach. So it's not as much around incentives as it is around enabling them to think more systematically about the ecosystem, the services that are provided by natural systems. There can be a wide range of incentives actually incorporated into the design of nature-based programs, including, direct payments or more secure land tenure, or access to extension services or information about regenerative agriculture or new agroforestry systems, for example, that kind of thing. And if you really want to build in policy and regulatory frameworks that are supportive as well, including on the marketing of products derived from natural systems, either highly managed or otherwise, those will be quite important. So I agree it's an important question, but I do find that communities understand, as long as you're not really taking away, you're adding to their livelihood options, they tend to be quite supportive and very knowledgeable about the systems within which they live and operate.
Thanks. Thank you so much, David. And we have a comment also from Ina in the chat to try and understand the disincentives as well. And we're requesting Paul here to take up these issues of validation, scaling, incentives, disincentives as he moderates the panel. And we have the poll results. They're in front of me, so I hope they're in front of everybody here. But we're seeing here that we have quite a mix of participants. So we have some from the government, the MDBs, private sector, and other NGOs. And we're seeing that the request for nature-based solution scaling issues and the things that people are most interested in learning about are also quite diverse. So there seems to be a lot of learning that's required across the various topics associated with nature-based solutions. And also there's diversity in terms of the type of knowledge activities. So there's demand for case studies, for facilitated exchange, for toolkits and guidelines as the top ones. So thank you for this input. We'll be using it to design future activities. But for now, I'm going to pass to Paul to moderate the panel, reintroduce the panel, and then have a facilitated conversation. Thank you so much, Paul. Paul, you can take this opportunity to answer any of the questions as well, because you may have a few things to say about incentives. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Neha. Yeah, and just related to the engagement and incentives for Indigenous people, local communities. So one of the important financing windows that's in the NPC, as it was within the Forest Investment Program, is a direct financing window for Indigenous people, local communities. So it's really not about incentivizing engagement. It's about empowering Indigenous people, local communities to contribute to the solutions. So I think this is one of the things that we're most excited about innovating through our FIT program. and really engaging these people who, as David mentioned, are at the coalface of many of these, the impacts of nature degradation, of climate change, to have them provide their solutions and how best to deal with that. So I think David has set us up really well for the panel discussion. Really, this is a great opportunity here from our experts from the countries who are working on the NPC investment plans, how they see scaling of NBS, including in his question about disincentives or trade-offs, as we've called them. So we're actively working with our government and MDB partners to develop investment plans, which will lead to projects within the 10 programs that that are now in the NPC, and this is our chance to hear some of their reflections. We also really want to hear from you. This is your opportunity to ask questions and get responses from people who are really on the ground dealing with these challenges. All of these presentations that I do, they're very conceptual, and the reality is once the rubber hits the road and you get to the ground, that those concepts tend to break apart, and you're dealing with hard questions and challenging issues. So that's our chance here to hear directly from those people who are trying to respond to that. And I'll introduce the panelists now. So we're very happy to have, as we mentioned, Dr. Daniela Faria, who's a sustainable finance analyst from the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. So Daniela has been working on Brazilian initiatives related to the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Fund, and she's currently leading the Brazilian Investment Plan for the NPC. So this investment plan, as I mentioned, she spent 10 years working on sustainability issues on such themes as corporate greenhouse gas inventory, ESG, changes in carbon stocks, climate risks, and many others. So we're very happy to have Daniela. Next, we have Hisham Osman, who's a senior engineer with the World Bank. Hisham is the task team leader for 2 NPC countries, Kenya and Rwanda. He specializes in water resources management, as well as developing and applying modeling tools for hydrology and hydraulics assessment. And then we have Rodrigo Fincheira, who's a senior advisor to the executive vice president of the Climate Change Council of the Dominican Republic. Rodrigo is an economist by profession, but has spent 28 years working as a consultant in banking and as an entrepreneur. He also happens to be a farmer who has been trying to implement his own NBS solutions on his farm, so it'll be very interesting to hear from him. And then finally, Dr. Adifir Worku, who's the chair of the technical committee of the Green Legacy Initiative of Ethiopia, who has over 20 years experience working on forestry, environment, climate change, livelihoods, and green economy. He's currently with the Ethiopian Forestry Department in the Research, Development, Academia, and Industry interface. So thank you to the panelists. And the first thing that I'd like to ask, and again, for those of you online, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat as we go through this, but I want to hear some introductory reflections from the panelists. Why NBS is a priority for you personally, as it relates to the background and interest that I just went through. Also, how does your country and institution prioritize nature-based solutions in its approach to tackling climate change, mitigation or adaptation, and what the potential for NBS is in your country? So Daniela, we will start with you on that. Over to you.
Hi, good morning to all. First of all, thank you for the invite for participating in this panel. So I'm a chemical engineer and I have a doctorate in environmental engineering, and I have been working in the public sector for almost 7 years now. In this journey, I have spent 3 years working and living in the Amazon region. So there I learned real experiences for nature-based solution projects and why we have the need for simple solutions and actions that can have great impact here in Brazil. So Brazil faces a reality that the top ranking deforestation municipalities are also the worst ranking in health, sanitation, education, food security, and violence indexes. So we see here a scenario that inequality and poverty are a great obstacle to sustainable development. And these fosters the need to have a vision of sustainable development that puts people at the very heart of public policies. So nature-based solutions in this sense is very much aligned with the need to place more emphasis on adaptation, social needs, IPLC, which are all important for us in Brazil as a developing country. Overall, Brazil has a natural vocation for NBS, but it's difficult to frame and define NBS in a country like Brazil with large territorial extension and diversity. So what we see here in practice, especially with the NPC program, is that NBS is a new and complex concept, which people here in Brazil are not yet very familiar with. So it's difficult to determine whether an action encompasses the concept of NBS broadly or only punctually. So how can we determine and measure if a project is capable of generating an integrated positive impact in the landscape and not only locally? So we do not necessarily use NBS as a premise for prioritizing actions, but since it is a comprehensive concept in practice, what we see is that a lot of our programs and projects already encompasses many of the NBS concepts. So I saw that David mentioned that NBS is very widespread but unsystematic. I think we have this experience in Brazil. It's hard to, it's not the baseline to build actions yet, but it actually is involved with many actions that we have. And a real example, for example, is the Brazilian Amazon Sustainable Landscape Project that we have here. And one of its pillars is the promotion of integrated landscape management. So we see that we do have actions in that sense. We prioritize NBS, but not as a guideline. And I think we should build more capacity from now on to encourage having NBS as a guideline from the beginning of setting up projects and programs. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Hisham, over to you for your introductory comments. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to be in this very important learning platform. So as you mentioned briefly in your introduction, I'm based in Nairobi and I work with the World Bank in the environment and climate change and sustainable natural resources management space. So from my experience working in this space from the MDP side, we have seen it's very important to scale up the intervention and working supporting governments and community in adopting nature-based solutions. For example, as we all know, communities are facing growing challenges to adapt to climate change while managing the impacts of climate of multiple global crises. Roughly around 26 million people have been pushed to poverty every year because of disasters. So adaptation measures are needed now, and for regions like Africa in particular, which are rich in natural assets and resources. And therefore, nature-based solution can be a cost-effective solution that comes with several important development benefits, including jobs. For example, the World Bank over the last 10 years has invested or financed over 100 projects that include nature-based solutions to build resilience, and is increasing its involvement in this type of investments, because it's very important to invest in NPS as a measure to reverse the degradation that's happening in the nature, and to build resilience in communities. So from the MDP side, I think it's very important to work with all the partners at the global and national levels to mobilize financing for climate and nature action. That's why we see programs like NBC is very important, because it can really play the role of catalytic in setting up programs that invests in integrated approach for mainstreaming nature solutions in a way that will help set a platform or lay the foundations for a long-term engagements, because investing in nature and reversing the damage that has been done will take a while. So it's very important to invest in a program that adopts integrated approach, and that has also a very clear monitoring, reporting, and verification system, so that it can systematically show the impacts. And as David mentioned, I think Daniela also mentioned this, it's very important to show in a very systematic manner the impacts that we are making when we are investing in NPS programs or projects, because that will be a very important element in showing the benefit and mobilizing resources and financing down the road to work on this area, because the financing gaps or the needs for climate and nature action is huge. So it requires multiple stakeholders to work on this. Let me stop here, Paul, and hand over to you in my short introduction. Thanks.
Thank you, Hisham. And I think we'll talk in a little bit about some of those financing gaps and perhaps how private sector can help to fill that. Rodrigo, over to you in English or Spanish, whichever you prefer. You're still on mute, Rodrigo.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me now? Okay. When I hear my bio described from you, it shows I've been moving around for a long time, but sustainability was not one part of my bio. So I would say I've been working in sustainability for a while now. Let's say it's about 10 years. If you could, I'll take my time to speak in Spanish, so translator will be available. Como decía, yo trabajo en sostenibilidad y como cualquier persona que trabaja en sostenibilidad soy un apasionado del tema. No creo que alguien pueda trabajar en sostenibilidad y no estar apasionado por lo que hace. Mi background de economista me hace ver que nuestros modelos productivos están llegando a tener rendimientos decrecientes, mayormente por variables que creíamos que eran exógenas al modelo. Mientras estuvimos pensando que habíamos encontrado formas de sacar mayor rendimiento de los recursos naturales, no fuimos capaces de entender que estamos influyendo en sistemas complejos que tenían una forma de estructurarse y que las ventajas que extraíamos de forma antisistémicas terminarían erosionando el sistema completo. Hemos hecho un free riding con los modelos naturales sin darnos cuenta de que los recursos que estamos utilizando recursos indirectamente. Creo que nos falta humildad y conocimiento de los sistemas complejos de la naturaleza. Tiene años desarrollando. Tengo la impresión que es más fácil, más rentable y más lógico trabajar con los sistemas naturales que intentar dominar y extraer los recursos. Hay algo que no está en mi bio, pero al final sí, Paul lo mencionó. Tengo 2 años desarrollando la primera granja de moscas soldados negros de mi país y estamos intentando convertir residuos orgánicos que antes se pudrían y emitían metano en abono y proteínas para la industria animal. ¿Cómo incentivamos y cuidamos el ciclo de vida de esta especie y dejamos que la naturaleza haga lo que está diseñado a hacer? Es una forma muy interesante de producir. Para mí, las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza son obviamente importantes y son una nueva forma de enfrentar la problemática. Lo primero que tenemos que entender es que la naturaleza es magnífica, pero es compleja, es dinámica y no lineal. Dedicar un predio a un monocultivo es realmente no haber aprendido nada de la historia natural de nuestro planeta y desaprovechar el ciclo natural por falta de conocimiento. En nuestro país hemos aplicado algunas soluciones basadas en la naturaleza. Las más comunes son la rearborización por café y cacao en nuestras lomas. Nosotros esperamos que este programa de Nature People and Climate nos pueda llevar aún más lejos en este conocimiento. Y esperamos que esta plataforma nos logre encontrar puntos de unión con otras culturas que hayan desarrollado otro tipo de soluciones que nos permitan replicar en nuestro país. Yo espero que esta plataforma sea muy exitosa. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Adifir, please, over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Paul, very much, and I hope I heard. I would like to use this window of opportunity once again, thank CIF for giving Ethiopia this opportunity, because this the CIF support to scale up best practice nature-based solutions is really a huge support for my country, because Ethiopia has been already embarked in implementing nature-based solution at a large scale. So going back to the question, why nature-based solution is important to me personally, how it is prioritized in my country, and also the potential of implementing nature-based solutions in Ethiopia. As a forester and also as a climate specialist, I have been struggling for several years to bring together the different aspects of environmental management. For instance, conserving existing natural forests, which used to be, the priority of the government of Ethiopia. Not reforestation, for instance, not, restoration for many years, but only focusing on conserving existing natural forest. But for a forester, for an environmentalist, conserving existing natural forest is not the only solution to sustainably manage your landscape. And in the past few years, again, landscape restoration, tree planting has become a very important agenda for the government, and less emphasis was given to conserving existing natural forests. This is a problem. But over recent years, that we tried to this knowledge of nature-based solution approach has become an agenda and penetrates through the policy discourses. And the nature-based solution, as it was already defined by David, it gives you the opportunity to integrate variety of land management intervention. Like you may restore landscape degraded ecosystem services, you can conserve what we have, and a more important nature-based solution has given us an opportunity to make people the center of the planning, and to make people the center of the implementation of that activities or land management activities. And the nature-based solution, as an approach, it has given us the opportunity to empower communities, and also to get their acceptance of conserving natural forests or sustainably managing critical ecosystem services, and also to make forest out of those billions of seedlings that have been planted over the last many years. So nature-based solution, it gives you a lot of opportunity, to bring a long list of menu to manage your land green and manage your ecosystem services for the benefit of the community. So that means that professionally, it has been, answering, addressing all my challenges, environmental challenges, livelihood challenges, and also policy level challenges. So it is really a very, very important approach of land management, or an approach to mitigate climate change, environmental crisis, so on and so forth. Ethiopia has been prioritizing nature as the solution because it has become the first, the second, the third option for Ethiopia, because we are becoming more socially, ecologically, and environmentally vulnerable to climate change, desertification, impact of invasive species, and youth migration, conflict, so on and so forth, so that through this approach, through promoting and scaling up best practice of nature-based solution, now we have been seeing its fruit, where our peoples have been, staying on their landscape because they started to restore those lost ecosystem services. So this is an agenda. For instance, the Prime Minister himself is leading this initiative called the Green Legacy Initiative, which is, one of the three big flagship programs of the country, just next to renewable energy infrastructure development, the Green Legacy Initiative, which aims to plant 50 billion seedlings. I think this number is a very crazy number, actually, when you hear it, to it. And this is, an agenda led by the government, the Prime Minister himself, which is also cascaded to the regional presidents and also his cabinet. So designing and implementing a nature-based solution is a priority, almost the second biggest flagship program in the country, and supported by public, funds. Potential, in fact, there is a potential. Recently, a US-based institution, World Resource Institution, WRI, has did a very comprehensive assessment for Ethiopia, and they came with this very important map telling us that almost half of Ethiopia, 54 million hectares. Ethiopia is about 112 million hectares. Almost half of the land mass of the country is suitable for tree-based landscape restoration, which is going to benefit biodiversity conservation, ecosystem restoration, and also empowering communities, particularly youth and women. So there is a huge potential for Ethiopia to implement a nature-based solution. And the support of this CIF project that is now we have been developing with our MDBs is really going to, a showcase for our country. And yeah, that is what I wanted to say. And sorry for being long, Paul.
Thank you so much. No, we appreciate the passion that you've demonstrated about NBS and about your own experience. And now we want to get to some of the core questions, some of which we've already heard from the questions raised, or touched on from the questions raised in the chat. And again, I would encourage all of the participants to start thinking of your questions and get them into the chat. So the first question is to you, Daniela, particularly around stakeholder involvement. As we've already heard, nature, biodiversity, ecosystem services are really important to indigenous people and local communities, and nature-based solutions projects can have an impact on these communities. Obviously, within Brazil, there's been a rebirth of interest in these interests. So we'd really like to hear from you about how you and the project are going to work to ensure involvement and good outcomes for these indigenous communities, women, and in general for more equitable and inclusive development. Daniela, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, as I said in my opening line, nature-based solution can put people at the very heart of adaptation public policy. So the NPC program has the potential to provide economic independence to vulnerable communities and traditional communities. And we have some opportunities here. For example, social biodiversity products that can generate employment and income for these communities, and the importance of rescuing traditional knowledge so that we can value traditional knowledge for integrated landscape management. Regarding the NPC program and the investment plan itself, we have a challenge, right? How to ensure positive and inclusive results? How can we make sure that these communities, these people will be included in the investment plan from the beginning and in a comprehensive manner? So what we're doing here is that we have finished our scoping mission recently, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. And since this new government, we have a new structure with more representation that can the historic social participation process that has been traditional here in Brazil. So we have now a Ministry of Indigenous People, a Ministry of Racial Equality, and a Ministry of Women. All these representatives from these ministries have been consulted during the scoping mission and will continue to be consulted during the investment planning process. And they will work as sort of technical consultants so that we can make sure that the activities designed will be effective in addressing each group's specific needs. We wanted to foster participation of producers and local communities. So we have been looking at the payments for environmental services as an alternative for that, for this incentive. And I would also like to mention another challenge that we have, that is the gender issue in the field in rural areas. How can we give the woman the leading role if the most common dynamic here is the man ahead of the family in rural production? So even though there is a long-lasting participation of women in the countryside, data from 2015 showed that only half of the rural women were officially economically active, and about 30% of them did not receive any type of income for their work in the field. So what we see in practice is that women are responsible for key conservation activities and play important roles in rural properties, but this does not show necessarily in official numbers. So we have a need to have qualitative and not so much quantitative indicators, and I think the platform could help thinking about that and elaborating, formulating more real qualitative indicators that make sure that women are in fact participating, not only shown by official numbers. And also the importance of having capacity building and technological advances that can offer even more opportunities for women's participation in the field to grow.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks for that very helpful input, particularly on the gender side and ways that the platform can support you in answering these challenging questions. I will also put a plug in again for what we hope will be the next nature series on MBS and gender. Over to you, Hisham. So you had mentioned some of the challenges in mobilizing finance in your introductory remarks. And I've also highlighted some of the challenges that the CIF has had, particularly on the land side, in engaging the private sector. Of course, this will be critical if we're going to crowd in investments, mainstream interventions, and make them sustainable. So as you're representing the 1MDB on the panel, it'd be interesting to hear how you're thinking about the role of private sector and innovation in NBS. Hisham, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. As I mentioned, briefly in my intro remarks, it's very hard to, in terms of mobilizing the resources that needed to reverse the rapid decline in nature requires scaling to scale up finance from all sources towards sustainable practices. And that's what we call, if you may, you can call financing green, and also shift investments away from the harmful practices, and that's what we refer to as greening the finance. So it's about the quantity of finance, but also more it's about streamlining access and improving impact. And as I also mentioned very briefly, in the way that we need to improve the impact, we need to be very much systematic. We need to be very much strategic in having programs like NPC to help to help build the infrastructure or the proof of concept that needed to build the momentum to move forward. So on the side of the public sector, as you know, many governments have limited access to affordable market-based or concessional financing to fund holistic nature-based, nature-positive investment portfolio, and that's largely because of the fiscal constraints that we have, not just in Africa, but many other countries across the world. Sovereigns are not rewarded for prioritizing and mainstreaming nature-positive investments, and there is an over-reliance, if you may say, on government budgets, donor grant-funded projects, and niche small-scale transaction. That's the challenge on the government side. So, and again, this is where I think we can make the difference with having programs like MPC, where we can help the governments to establish these programs. And then after we create the platform, and hopefully we can get multiple partners to come on board. But talking more specifically about the private sector, the challenge is there is a lack of bankable and financial and profitable commercially viable projects. Financial products that directly finance nature action are nascent, and environmental, social, governance, and impact investors have limited options to channel capital to directly support projects that deliver nature conservation outcomes. And that's especially in the lower and middle income countries. Potential investors in nature-oriented action are often discouraged by the lack of the direct financial return and common standard for measuring the risk. So here it's very important on how we can prove the concepts and show that the direct financial return, setting up good programs, etc. But also how can we come up with common standards for measuring the risk to help the private sector engage in financing NPS. There are two ways that we need to work together with development partners and market makers to reduce this gap. For the greening finance, we need to work on directing financial flows away from projects and programs that determinately impact biodiversity and ecosystem services toward investments that mitigate the negative impact and deliver positive environmental co-benefits. And as I mentioned on the financing green, we need to make investments in the projects that help contribute conservation, restoration, sustainable land use, and of green and blue biodiversity ecosystem services. So, mobilizing financing for climate and nature action also requires a use of policy, debt, and non-debt instruments. And as mentioned, that these kind of solutions will also require strengthening policy and institutions to close the knowledge gap, as David mentioned earlier, but also to channeling public and private financing to keep the strong focus on maximizing the development outcomes.
Isha, maybe you can wrap up. We're running a little tight on time here.
Okay,
as well.
so just like on some of the financial instruments that we can do, for example, and what we have tried in the bank, Paul, is we can do some of capital market solutions to help channel the funds from institutional investors to nature. For example, we could use instruments like Pay for Success financial structure. In the bank, we have used that for the wildlife conservation bond in South Africa. That was around 150 million. Another way we could do that is basically we do, the principal protected emission reduction linked bond that provides investor return linked to the issuance of verified carbon units expected to produce by project. So these are some of the ideas that can be used to channel funding from private sector. So in a nutshell, we need to help the governments getting their policy institutions setting up good programs, help the private sector by de-risking the market and coming up with products that financially proven. And then I think then you will get more traction from the private sector to invest in the nature base. So let me stop here and over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Hisham. And again, I think these are really critical points and challenges that the program's going to have, and hopefully through the learning platform we can delve deeper into this and figure out collectively with the MDBs and the government how we can really bring the private sector into the program and get them more engaged in these nature-based solutions other than carbon credits. There are so many other ways to do it. So I appreciate that insight and that experience that you've had from the bank, which is encouraging, but also the challenge is quite big. So next is to Rodrigo, who I'm going to ask a little bit about some of the risks and trade-offs in MBS, because within the Dominican Republic, the program's working, as David showed, on a ridge-to-reef approach throughout the entire unit watershed. So going from forested land to agricultural rice land all the way to the coast. And within that, there are clearly some win-win land management solutions. But we've already heard a little bit in a question about the disincentives to MBS. So I'd like to hear from you, Rodrigo, about what you see as the trade-offs in land management related to climate mitigation, adaptation, development, and how you're navigating these. And I will unfortunately have to say to you and to Adi Fire that we're running a little short on time. So if you can make your intervention succinct, that would be great. Rodrigo, over to you.
Mira, Paul, mientras más profundizamos en nuestros modelos de desarrollo a espalda de la naturaleza, más cerca estarán los límites de las formas de producción y obviamente vemos más claro los trade-offs entre conservación y desarrollo. Esta forma de pensamiento ampliamente aceptada pone al ser humano como un ente exógeno a los sistemas naturales y nosotros como especie muchas veces nos posicionamos así. El desafío justamente es utilizar soluciones endógenas a un sistema al cual como especie pertenecemos. La cuenca es un sistema natural que va de la loma al arrecife. La cuenca del río Yuna es el hábitat de 2 millones de personas y es muy evidente que tenemos trade-offs en el uso del agua, de calidad, así como en el uso de otros recursos. Y entre las actividades productivas y entre las actividades productivas que desarrollamos como seres humanos en la cuenca y entre estas y la naturaleza. Pero cuando hacemos un análisis más profundo, también nos topamos con que hay trade-offs en el uso de otros recursos naturales que están disminuyendo la resistencia de la cuenca a los embates del cambio climático. Tenemos que tomar en cuenta que existen infraestructuras ya creadas en la cuenca como embalses y otros, y el desafío ahora es cómo pensar en un sistema en el que la naturaleza, el sistema natural pueda aprovechar esta infraestructura como parte de la solución del desarrollo global del sistema. Queda claro que el uso de los recursos a destajo de esta cuenca no está teniendo en cuenta los límites de los sistemas naturales y que si bien existen algunas iniciativas para el control de las emisiones como soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, es bastante más lo que podemos hacer. Tenemos que promover prácticas agrícolas sostenibles que pueden implicar y reducir la actividad ganadera local. Tenemos que implementar pagos por servicios ambientales. Tenemos que fomentar los ingresos generados por el ecoturismo. Tenemos que fomentar la economía azul de forma que abordemos una gestión cuidadosa para evitar la sobreexplotación marina. Yo creo que gran parte del desafío que tenemos ahora mismo es cultural. Globalmente hemos diseminado las especies que cultivamos y que crecemos, pero el conocimiento ancestral de cómo usar estas especies no lo hemos logrado globalizar. Algunas prácticas que para algunos en Asia son evidentes, no son tan evidentes para nosotros aquí en Latinoamérica. El uso de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza muchas veces viene de culturas milenarias que tenemos que tratar de desarrollar entre unos y otros. En resumen, nosotros entendemos que haciendo un approach que venga from reach to reef, vamos a lograr tener un análisis sistémico de la problemática completa y podremos aplicar soluciones basadas en la naturaleza que eliminen un poco esos trade-offs y ayuden en win-win en forma conjunta en la cuenta completa. Gracias.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And yeah, I mean, I think this is, as I mentioned earlier, as we move from conceptual MBS, which is what's being talked about within the broader community, to actually how it's applied on the ground, this is really where the learning is going to happen. I think that they're understanding these trade-offs, understanding the challenges that implementing these approaches is going to be a key part of the learning that we can hopefully bring out to the broader community. Okay, so Dr. Adifire, I'm going to ask you to be very brief. You've already touched on some of the challenges that we have in understanding awareness of nature-based solutions based on your vast experience in Ethiopia. But as Ethiopia is also new to the CIF in programming, it'd be good to hear from you how you see the learning platform being useful to you and others within the CIF community. And again, if you can be brief so that we can get to the questions in the chat. There's been some good questions there. That would be great. Dr. Adifire, over to you.
Thank you very much. And also, I would like to thank the other presenters because it's already happening, because of this platform. I am already learning from colleagues who have been, speaking here. And the experience from Brazil is going to be very important for Ethiopia because we do have, a lot to share together. The comment from the World Bank, in Ethiopia, even with this CIF scoping emission, one of the areas that we identified is how to engage the private sector's nature-based solution designing and implementation, because yet in my country, the private sector is really not that much interested, for instance, implementing, in investing on land. Mainly the private sector is going for these project areas like energy sector. I think it is going a little bit fine. Transport is going a little bit fine, but the majority of them have been investing on the manufacturing and also on the service side. Very few, for instance, on forest conservation, ecotourism development, landscape restoration, so on and so forth. And even sometimes there is a conflict between foresters and the private sector. Like the majority of the commercial agriculture in Ethiopia is, for instance, owned by the private sector, where you see some conversion of critical ecosystems, forest landscape, biodiversity hotspots, so on and so forth. So this is the time where we really need to convince the private sector, for instance, and to engage, even if they engage in the agricultural sector development, but also to integrate, for instance, biodiversity conservation, supporting the local community not to be displaced from their ancestral land, so on and so forth. Like trees used to be considered as wood in the agriculture investment in commercial agriculture in Ethiopia. This is to be really challenged, that trees are not weed, but they are an instrumental means to sustain the agriculture sector and also to even minimize the cost of investment for the private sector. What I wanted to say is that really this platform, this is going to be very important for us, not only for this CIF project development, but also for sustaining those initiatives, nature-based initiative, and also other climate-smart initiatives that we have been implementing on the ground. And particularly, designing a project, nature-based solution project, and implementing them needs, a mobilization of financial resource, and it needs, mobilization of human resource, technological support, and for that, working together with those communities, listening to their approach, learning from them, listening to their challenges, listening to their best practice is going to be really very much supportive for us. And I really very much appreciate the launching of this learning platform because, nature-based solution, as I said, for instance, if you consider traditional ecological knowledge system and local institution, local knowledge, local practices, local mechanisms. Sometimes in the past, those knowledge were disrecognized by the science itself even. And it is now that we started to talk again about the indigenous communities, their institutions, the knowledge. How Brazil is really able to integrate, this knowledge system of the local community into project development. How Kenya is doing that, and how Ethiopia has been, trying to integrate, is going to support a lesson to other communities. And so I see this, learning platform as a very important platform where we consolidate knowledge and the being togetherness. It also, serve as
Dr. Adi Fires, I think we're gonna have to leave it there.
Yeah,
that's a great way to end because we have a lot of really good questions that we also want you to answer. But I think you've really set the learning platform up with a great endorsement, and we hope that this will be the start of a good place for us. And of course, we want to continue to get that input that you have and find other opportunities. But I do want to make sure that we can get to the questions. So I'm going to run through some of them quickly. So the first question was about capacity initiatives being implemented by the CIF or MPC, working particularly with communities. So I just on that quickly, I think obviously the learning platform, as it evolves, as we bring in additional financing, can provide that type of capacity building. But I also do want to highlight again that we will have this dedicated grant mechanism, which is a financing window for communities, and within that, there are capacity building initiatives. We have a global program that is responsible for helping the communities with various challenges that they're facing, specifically related to how they can be part of the solution. So there's a direct granting mechanism to the communities, but there's also an overall program that will help to build capacity with the communities. The next is about the MPC theory of change in the context of disparate and disconnected nature and smaller MPC projects and what's happening in different sectors. What is the experience of panelists uniting these disparate projects? So with that one, basically this is the goal of what these investment plans are supposed to do, is to take a holistic approach, but maybe one of the panelists, Daniela or Hisham, you're doing this in two countries. Maybe Daniela, you've had good experience working on nature-based solutions in Brazil. Maybe you can relay how you see this investment planning process as bringing together different smaller sectoral approaches. Can I turn that one to you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Specifically on our investment plan, I'm going back to our expression of interest, because in our expression of interest, we had 3 pillars. So it was 3 different aspects that I think they can be combined together in one solution or a few solutions that are integrated. So we had the conservation and recovery of degraded ecosystems, bioeconomy and sustainable value chains, and low carbon agriculture production. What we saw during our scoping mission is that at first we wanted to divide the pillars, like the actions were in one pillar or in another one, but then at the end we saw that actions were cross sectional in the pillars. So we are seeking an integrated solution that encompasses all the pillars. And I think this exemplifies very good the concept of NBS, because it is an integrated concept, a systematic approach. So I think the more we can have solutions and projects and actions that provide this integrated impact, the more we can gain.
Great, thank you. So we're only gonna have time for one more question. Being as there's some interest on this private sector angle, are the private sector, who are generally motivated by making profits, really interested in investing in NBS? I know Hisham, you had talked about that, but Rodrigo expressed interest in replying to this from his perspective on the ground. So Rodrigo, I will turn that question over to you. And again, if you can be as succinct as possible, that'd be appreciated.
Yes, my first reaction to that question is that it needs to change the focus. Private sector does not need to needs to know about nature-based solutions in order to engage in them. They're beneficiary. They give really good income. Black soldier fly market, by instance, it's going to be about 1 billion global industry worldwide by 2030. The project like the Macaúba in Brazil is providing very good revenues. Projects for making ranching in fruit, mixing ranching and fruits give farmers more extra income. So private sector will be engaged because there is revenue in nature-based solutions. The problem is, do private sector acknowledge nature-based solutions? Do we have enough information about them? How can we get them enticed in engaging in nature-based solutions? That's the information we need private sector to cope with, so they'll be invested in.
Thank you so much, and it's great to hear the perspective of not just a government official, but also an entrepreneur in this, who's walking the talk, particularly in what you're doing with your own farming land. So I'd like to give the panelists, unfortunately that was all the time we have, the panelists a virtual round of applause. I see Daniela, you have your hand up, so I'm going to give you the last word, and then we'll turn it over to my colleague Anita for the wrap up. Please go ahead.
I'll be very quickly, I promise. No, I just wanted to raise one extra point, because I think nobody mentioned it, and it was there was a lot of discussion here in Brazil during our scoping mission about that, which is the problem of concessional resource for NBS. I think there are a lot of resistance from actors involved. It's very complex financially. We don't understand exactly who are the intermediaries and how will they assume the risk of an NBS project, and how, when you talk about local communities, small companies, startups, associations, and how will they be able to receive concessional funding. So I think the platform could help in shedding a light at this topic, because there was a lot of confusion here in Brazil about that, and we do not we are not very sure about if a project that we prioritize can be funded with concessional resource.
That's a very interesting point to make, and again, it demonstrates the newness of this approach, and still maybe the lack of understanding, awareness of both its benefits and of its potential return. So I think that's a good point to end on as we think about what the needs are and how we can continue to learn together on these really important points. As I said, I'd like to give the panelists a virtual round of applause. Thank you guys so much. That was really interesting. I wish we had another hour to talk to you, because it was a very engaging discussion. I think you answered some very challenging questions in as direct and honest a way as possible. So with that, I want to turn, turn over to my colleague Amita. I recognize we're a minute over time now, but Amita will do a quick wrap up, and then we will give you back the rest of your day. Thank you, Amita. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Over to you,
Paul.
Amita.
And thank you to our panelists. Just want to wrap by saying that, as we've heard from many of our speakers today, nature-based solutions are complex because they're ambitious and the benefits that they're aiming for, and also because it's a relatively new approach. And as Daniela said, it requires deep links between work at the policy level and at the community level. And as many of our speakers said, learning is our best chance to do that fast, and to not all make the same mistakes. So we can see even across Ethiopia, the Dominican Republic and Brazil, opportunities for learning, collaboration, and support. And this is exactly what the learning platform was set up to do. The platform is here to support you, the countries, and the MDBs. And so we really want to hear from you how to make it useful. Thank you for your questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get around to all of them, but we are going to use them to structure our future activities on the learning platform. I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to drop my email address in the chat. Please write to me with any feedback or suggestions for future activities. And also just want to say again to the speakers, thank you for taking the time. Thank you to Paul and Neha and all the CIF colleagues who assisted with this event. And thank you to you all for participating. The next event in the Nature series will happen in December, and we look forward to seeing you there.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you and bye.